Next, I'll draw a blade of grass from the bottom up where that water drop made contact with the ground. The first thing I want to do is rename my brushstroke from brush 1 to grass. I'll use Enter to accept that name, then open up the parameters for that brushstroke. Here under my stroke options, I can see that there is a start and an end value for where I've drawn. Rather than drawing each step for the growth of this blade of grass, I can control the start or the end of my brushstroke. Because we started at the bottom, then ended at the top, modifying the end value is going to make the stroke shorter as we decrease its size. At 100%, if we increase the start value, the brushstroke would not begin until later in the path that we drew. So if we create the start value of 50%, we can see here inside our layer window that the stroke itself doesn't actually begin until about halfway through of our brushstroke as we created it. We'll set this back to 0 and animate the value for the end. We'll slide this up because we want to see more parameters for our brushstroke. Here at the beginning of our brushstroke, we want the end value to be 0. We'll set a keyframe here. Then we'll jump 10 frames later by holding the Shift key down and using Page Down. We'll change the end value to 100%. And now scrubbing in our timeline, we can see that the water splashes and the grass grows. There's a little too much time between the water splash and the grass growing. I'll back up the playhead in the timeline to see where the water splash stops. I want to move all of the parameters of the grass growing by a few frames. I'll click on the layer for the brushstroke, then move back. I can see where the brushstroke starts, and if I move back, I can see where the water has ended. The brushstroke that I'm currently on doesn't match the level for the water. In order to move that, I can click and move the anchor point for my brushstroke layer, either in the layer window or in the options for my brushstroke transformation. If you want to modify this in the layer window, make sure that you have the selection tool active. Remember, if we have our brushstroke selected and use our paint tool, we're going to create a brand new path. So you can either use your selection tool here or move down into the transformations for the grass brushstroke. Then simply move it up. We'll move the position value for the Y up so that it matches the water area. Now when the grass grows, it begins at the level that the water has ended at. The last thing we'll do is kill the grass by animating a few more of the parameters. Here, under our path, we'll set a keyframe for the path of the grass after it's reached its full potential. Then using Shift and Page Down, we'll jump 10 frames forward and draw a new blade of grass, this time flat on the ground. 5 frames back between the two keyframes, we'll create a shape that looks like a withered piece of grass. Now, scrubbing between the keyframes, you can see how After Effects completes that animation. We also want to animate the color value of the stroke. So we'll set a keyframe for color at the first keyframe for our path. We'll match that with a keyframe for color at the last keyframe of our path. Now we can change the color of this to something a little more dark and looking more like dead grass. We'll click OK. The last thing we want to do is change the diameter of our brushstroke so that the grass withers and fades to nothing as it falls over. Again, we'll go back to the first keyframe of the path and set a keyframe for diameter. We'll go again to the last keyframe and set our diameter to 0. Now as the grass falls over, it starts to wither and shrivel up before it hits the ground. So to finish this out, we'll trim the layer to the brushstroke only to the frames that we really need, then double-click on the work area to expand that to the full composition, then switch over to our composition window, and you may want to change this to Paint on Transparent by clicking in the Effects control or down inside the timeline and turning on Paint on Transparent. Now I'll simply hit the 0 on the number pad to see the animation.